Hello. I want to begin by telling a little story that I read in the book When Church Stops Working, which we're studying. Protesters threw red paint all over the front of a church door. It was in Canada. And the reason why they threw paint is because that church in decades past had run a residential school for Indigenous children, attempting to eradicate their Indigenous identity. So it was a protest over the horrible treatment of those children that had been going on for 100 years. How should that church respond? Well, we're going to find out as we study chapter 3 in the book. The chapter is entitled, Stop All the Having and Just Be. Starting on page 37, the authors refer to comedian Aziz Ansari, saying that he returned to stand-up comedy in 2019. Now, this jumped out at me immediately because my family loves the television show Parks and Recreation, and Ansari was one of the main characters on the show. Well, that show had its final episode in February of 2015, and just a few months later, in November of that same year, Ansari launched his own show, Master of None, and he was just widely acclaimed as being a comic genius. But something happened. In 2018, allegations came out that he had been treating women, particularly in the area of sexual misconduct, and the show was canceled. But now, a year later, Ansari was back. The authors in the book focus on this particular stand-up show that he did with Netflix, and they're looking at the final 6 minutes. They say that Ansari takes a very different approach to what might be a typical conclusion to a comedy show. And they say this, it's a bold claim. They say what Ansari did at the final 6 minutes of that comeback show was what your church should do. Or better, they say, what we think your church should be about. I read that and thought, whoa, a disgraced comedian did something so important the church should take notice? What are they referring to? What did Ansari do that was so meaningful? Well, I had to watch for myself. In fact, it almost brought me to tears. I might actually have had tears if it's not for the fact that I take Lexapro for anxiety, to be honest with you, because the clip is powerful. What Ansari does is tell us that he has changed. He used to exit these comedy shows with a real bold and joyful, very typical of his personality, thank you, good night, and walk off the stage. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of an exit, but Ansari tells the crowd in the show, he didn't mean it. Instead, as he was saying goodnight and goodbye, he was immediately thinking about the next show, the next thing, the next television program. Well, at this comeback show's conclusion, he stops. He pauses. He thanks the crowd at length for all that they did to come and see him. He then invites them to consider what it means to be present in that moment. And even asks the audience to join him in a moment of silent reflection about their unique moment of being together. And only then does he finally say thank you and good night. And he goes and greets some of the people in the front row, and slowly he leaves the stage. A powerful moment. You might be thinking, okay, yeah, that is different. It's not what you normally expect from a comedian. But is that so important that the authors would claim that the church should take notice? Well, here's what they explain. They say in contemporary American society, we feel the demands to have more and go faster. As churches, we want more resources, and as people, we want the good life, which means more activities that we believe will bring meaning. And so the authors suggest that An approach to dealing with the crises that we feel in our lives is defined by one word, and that is more. I think about that when it comes to my family finances. I think to myself, if I could only get my doctoral dissertation published as a book, then my family will have extra income and we'll be financially secure for the rest of our lives. Well, any published authors who are just hearing me say this will probably be laughing their heads off because they know how little one published book, most often, especially a book in the Christianity and theology segment, will actually earn an author. But I'm sharing with you my inner thoughts because they reveal how I, like I think many of us, believe in this gospel of more. If I do the more, like writing a book, then I believe my life will be better. So what is the more that you believe in? What is the more that you feel will make you happier? The authors go on to point out the fraudulent claims of the gospel of more, writing that when we enslave ourselves to that idea of pursuing more and more and more, we don't feel happier, freer, or more at peace. Instead, we feel harried and stressed out, depressed, isolated, angry. Worse, they write, we barely recognize how weird it all is because we're so busy. We don't have time to evaluate. And they say the secular rush can lead us to stop feeling alive because we can no longer just be. So is busiest best? American culture seems to believe so. Christians too, in the church. And the authors point out that we assume that the busiest church is the healthiest church because they have so many programs. They must be doing things right. I wrestle with it every day, and I have for my 20 plus years of pastoral ministry. I suspect you wrestle with it too, even in your context, whether that is a ministry context or not. How busy should we be? On January 1st, 2018, I pressed the deactivate button on my Facebook account. Now, I didn't terminate my account, but deactivation essentially put me in hiding on Facebook. I deleted the Facebook app on my phone, and I deleted the browser tab on my laptop. Why? Because I had just started that day a 3-month-long sabbatical, and I didn't want my next 3 months to be consumed with scrolling. I wanted to disconnect. So, when I held my finger above the mouse and was about to click deactivate, I felt nervous. I'd spent a lot of time on Facebook for the previous 8+ years since I first started my account. I had a lot of interaction with people there, and mostly it was very good, sometimes a little bad, but I was nervous that my disappearance would have some kind of an effect on me. Negative effect. In fact, I had listened to a podcast that said that every pastor should be on Facebook because most of their congregation is on Facebook. And I get the heart behind that, and so I thought, am I doing something wrong here? Well, no. In fact, nothing happened when I clicked deactivate. Nothing happened the next day, the next week, the next 3 months for the whole sabbatical. So I just stayed off Facebook well beyond the sabbatical. Now, eventually I returned to reactivate my account, but I still don't have the app on my phone and don't have a tab on my browser. Now, what I have to admit is that I do have my church's Instagram account on my phone. And man, do I wish I could get rid of that one too. Why? Because I have to admit, I can get sucked into watching videos on Instagram. It's a time waster. Now, that's mostly on me. I should have the self-control to hold back and not get sucked into that. But I want us to focus on this larger point, and that is this: the lie of the gospel of more. That busier is better, whether that means more activities, programs, social media. It's a lie. And Aziz Ansari reveals the lie in the conclusion of his show. It relates to the church so deeply. We are so busy as a church, in most churches, believing that if we can just have a better worship service or the next class, another event, the next program, that is the solution to our decline. It's a lie. Instead, the authors remind us of the principle of Sabbath, which shares the same root word with sabbatical. We can have, actually, though, a warped idea of Sabbath. If all we're trying to do by resting is to get more. Get good rest on your day off so that you can work hard for the company throughout the rest of the week. Take a 3-month sabbatical so you can come back to us and then kill yourself for us for the next 7 years. How are Christians to respond to the enslavement of busyness in our society and churches? Well, the authors suggest that the solution is 3 steps to something that they call practicing being, not having. And the 3 steps are humble death, confession, and gratitude. First, they say that only dying can stop acceleration, and that dying should look like humility. And for those of you that want to learn more about humility, I highly recommend the book Humilitas by John Dixon. It's accessible and it's just a really powerful little book. Humility is essential for followers of Jesus. He's our example, and he also teaches it. He says to the disciples in Acts chapter 1 that they should wait for the gift of the Holy Spirit. He's asking them to practice humility rather than busyness. Paul will go on to write in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, that Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he gave it up to become human. He practiced humility. The authors describe humility like this. Humility is surrender, stopping, and confessing that having more cannot save us or our church. So that's the first point. We need to practice humble death. Second, in that definition of humility that I just read, there's a word confessing. We need to stop and confess that having more cannot save us. So there is the second point, confessing. The church needs to be a confessing church, a waiting church. Waiting, the authors say, for a deep connection with God. They suggest that church leadership meetings should start even with a public confession, corporately, together, that maybe we as a church have been addicted to the gospel of more, believing that our activity will save us rather than waiting on God and joining Him in His activity. So, first step, practice humility. Second step, practice confession. Third step in being, not having, is gratitude, a thankful heart, which humbly observes how much others in God have given to us. Now, I really encourage you to read the section on pages 49 and 50. The authors do an incredible job of explaining the depths of gratitude, especially as it relates to humility and confession. And here's one quote. They say this: "At the root of gratitude is connection. In being with these people in this place, in vulnerability, in need. That's waiting together. In humble confession of addiction to busyness that keeps us from truly seeing and caring for each other. And then, having confessed together, we move to gratefulness for each other and the opportunity to renew our care for one another." So the authors sum it up like this: a waiting church is waiting for God, waiting for the Spirit to move, and waiting to connect with God, opening ourselves to God's arriving by ministering to one another. They refer to the very sad stories of Mars Hill Church and the Southern Baptist Convention's recent implosions and scandals, and they contrast that with the story of Aziz Ansari, where he waited with his dying grandmother. Waiting churches, they say, find life not by giving attention to the future and the resources needed to escape decline, but by stewarding those connections we have with people now. And so we wait together in worship, in prayer, attending not to our resources or relevance, but to this moment with these people seeking God together. That's a quote from the book. And that, they say, brings us back to resonance. It's a concept they have mentioned in the previous chapters. They write, resonance is both the action of seeking connections and the result of that seeking. It seeks not growth, but depth, participation, and union. And that brings us back to the story of the red paint thrown on the church door. The chapter ends with that story, actually, but with no answer. How should the church respond? What does a waiting church do? A church that is seeking resonance? How do they handle that? Well, the answer is found in the principles earlier in the chapter. How might that church apply the 3 steps of being and not having to the red paint protest? And how might your church apply being, not having, with humility, confession, gratitude, seeking resonance together? How might you apply that to your community?